Number 1. Robert Johnson. He was a young man with a guitar, drifting through the Mississippi Delta, playing on street corners and in juke joints for spare change. To those who passed him, Robert Johnson seemed like just another wandering musician trying to scrape by. No one imagined that his brief recordings would reshape American music for generations. Born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, in 1911, Robert Leroy Johnson entered the world under uncertain circumstances. His mother, Julia Major Dodds, had been married to Charles Dodds, but Robert was the product of an affair with a plantation worker named Noah Johnson. The family dynamics were complicated from the start. Charles Dodds had fled Mississippi years earlier after a dispute with a white landowner, eventually settling in Memphis under a new name. Julia and her children moved between Mississippi and Tennessee throughout Robert's childhood, creating an unstable upbringing marked by poverty and displacement. As a boy, Robert showed little interest in formal education. He attended school sporadically and preferred to spend his time listening to music. The Delta was filled with blues musicians during that era, and young Robert absorbed their sounds at fish fries, church gatherings, and roadside performances. He married young, at just 16, to Virginia Travis. She became pregnant, but both she and the baby died during childbirth in 1930. Friends later said the loss devastated him. He threw himself into music with an intensity that bordered on obsession. In his early attempts at playing guitar, Robert struggled. Established musicians in the Delta reportedly mocked his efforts and dismissed him as talentless. Son House, one of the region's respected blues players, recalled that Robert would grab a guitar during breaks and produce sounds that made listeners cringe. But something changed after Robert disappeared for a period in the early 1930s. When he returned, his skills had transformed completely. He played with a fluidity and complexity that stunned those who had once laughed at him. The change was so dramatic that rumors began to spread. According to Delta legend, Robert Johnson had taken his guitar to a crossroads at midnight, where he met the devil. In exchange for his soul, the devil tuned the instrument and granted Robert supernatural ability. Whether the story originated with Robert himself or was invented by others remains unclear. What is certain is that the myth became inseparable from his music. His songs frequently referenced hellhounds, the devil, and forces beyond human control. Titles like Crossroad Blues, Me and the Devil Blues, and Hellhound on My Trail reinforced the perception that Robert had made a sinister bargain. By the mid-1930s, Robert Johnson was traveling constantly, performing wherever he could find an audience. He played in Arkansas, Texas, Tennessee, and across Mississippi. He never stayed in one place for long. Accounts from those who encountered him describe a restless man who seemed both charismatic and guarded. He was known to turn away from audiences while playing, possibly to hide his finger techniques from other musicians. He drank heavily, pursued women aggressively, and had a reputation for disappearing without warning. In November 1936, Robert traveled to San Antonio, Texas, for his first recording session. Over 3 days in a hotel room, he recorded 16 songs for the American Record Corporation. The session captured performances that would later be recognized as foundational texts of the blues. His voice was high and plaintive, his guitar work intricate and driving. Songs like Terraplane Blues demonstrated his ability to blend metaphor with raw emotion. The record sold well enough to earn him a second session. In June 1937, he returned to Dallas and recorded 13 more songs. These 29 recordings would constitute his entire official output. Despite the modest commercial success of some singles, Robert Johnson remained largely unknown outside the Delta blues circuit during his lifetime. He continued traveling and performing through 1937 and into 1938. He was reportedly considering a trip to New York, where producer John Hammond wanted to feature him at a concert celebrating African American music. That opportunity never materialized. On August 13, 1938, Robert Johnson performed at a juke joint near Greenwood, Mississippi. Accounts of what happened that night vary, but the most commonly accepted version involves a poisoned bottle of whiskey. Robert had been flirting with a married woman, and her husband allegedly tampered with an open bottle meant for the musician. Robert drank from it and became violently ill. Over the following days, his condition worsened. He developed a fever and experienced convulsions. Some witnesses said he crawled on the floor like an animal, barking and howling in agony. Robert Johnson died on August 16, 1938, at the age of 27. No official autopsy was performed. The cause was listed as "no doctor" on the death certificate, reflecting the lack of medical attention available to African Americans in the rural South at the time. Some later researchers suggested he died of congenital syphilis that flared under stress. Others maintained he was poisoned with strychnine. The truth remains unknown. His death received almost no public attention. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and for decades, even the location of his remains was disputed. 3 different sites in Mississippi have claimed to hold his body. The obscurity that surrounded his life continued after his death. The rediscovery of Robert Johnson began in the 1960s. Columbia Records released a compilation of his recordings in 1961, introducing his music to a new generation of listeners. Young musicians in Britain and America were electrified by his sound. Eric Clapton called him the most important blues musician who ever lived. Keith Richards described hearing Johnson's recordings as a revelation. Bob Dylan cited him as a primary influence. The Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and countless others drew from his catalog. Investigators and biographers spent decades piecing together the fragments of his life. 2 photographs were confirmed as authentic, showing a slender man with long fingers and an enigmatic expression. His songs were analyzed for hidden meanings and autobiographical clues. The Crossroads legend grew into one of the most enduring myths in popular music. In 1986, Robert Johnson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as an early influence. In 1990, Columbia released a boxed set of his complete recordings that sold over 1 million copies. A postage stamp bearing his likeness was issued in 1994. The young man who died in obscurity had become an icon. His legacy extends beyond the music itself. Robert Johnson's story established a template that would recur throughout the history of popular music. The brilliant artist consumed by personal demons. The life cut short before its full potential could be realized. The mythology that grows larger than the facts. These themes would echo in the deaths of those who followed him into the informal roster, now known as the 27 Club. Robert Johnson was not the first musician to die at that age, but he was among the first whose legend would be shaped by it. Today, fans travel to the Mississippi Delta to visit the crossroads where he supposedly made his deal. They leave guitars, coins, and flowers at the graves that may or may not contain his remains. His recordings, nearly 90 years old, continue to be studied, sampled, and celebrated. The man who once played for pennies on dusty street corners became one of the most influential figures in the history of recorded music. Robert Johnson left behind no interviews, no film footage, and only those 29 songs. Yet his influence is immeasurable. He proved that raw talent and emotional authenticity could transcend the limitations of time and technology. He also proved that some lives burn too brightly to last. The details of his final days remain shrouded in rumor and speculation. What endures is the music and the myth that surrounds it. His name has become synonymous with the price of genius and the fragility of life in the spotlight. Number 2. Brian Jones. He was the golden boy of the London music scene, a founder of one of the most successful rock bands in history. Yet by the summer of 1969, Brian Jones found himself cast out from the group he had created, adrift in a haze of drugs and paranoia. Born Louis Brian Hopkin Jones on February 28, 1942, in Cheltenham, England, he showed musical talent from an early age. His parents were middle class and conventional. His father was an aeronautical engineer who played piano, and his mother taught music. Brian excelled academically and learned multiple instruments, including clarinet, saxophone, and guitar. But he also exhibited a rebellious streak that would define his life. By 17, he had fathered 2 illegitimate children with different women and dropped out of school. In 1962, Brian moved to London with a vision of forming a blues band. He placed an advertisement in Jazz News seeking musicians and soon connected with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Brian named the group the Rolling Stones after a Muddy Waters song. In the early years, he was the undisputed leader. He booked gigs, handled finances, and shaped the band's sound. His multi-instrumental abilities added texture to their recordings, from the marimba on Under My Thumb to the sitar on Paint It Black. Critics and fans recognized him as the visual and musical centerpiece of the group. But as Jagger and Richards developed their songwriting partnership, Brian's influence diminished. He contributed fewer original compositions and struggled to keep pace with the band's evolving direction. His drug use escalated dramatically. He consumed LSD, cannabis, and amphetamines in quantities that alarmed those around him. Bandmates described him as increasingly erratic and unreliable. Recording sessions became tense as Brian arrived too impaired to perform. His relationships deteriorated. He cycled through girlfriends, some of whom later reported physical abuse. By 1969, the situation had become untenable. Brian faced legal troubles from multiple drug arrests, which threatened to prevent him from touring in the United States. In June, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts visited him at his home, Cochford Farm in Sussex. They informed him that his services were no longer required. The official statement claimed Brian had left due to musical differences. In private, everyone understood he had been fired. Less than a month later, on the night of July 1969, Brian hosted a small gathering at Cochford Farm. Guests included his girlfriend, Anna Wolin, and builder Frank Thorogood, who had been working on renovations. Around midnight, Brian decided to take a swim in his pool. What happened next remains disputed. According to initial accounts, he was found motionless at the bottom of the pool. Attempts to revive him failed. The coroner ruled his death as misadventure, noting that his liver and heart showed enlargement consistent with drug and alcohol abuse. He was 27 years old. Conspiracy theories emerged almost immediately. Frank Thorogood allegedly confessed to murdering Brian on his own deathbed in 1993, though the claim was never substantiated. Others suggested Brian was too intoxicated to save himself from drowning. The truth died with those present that night. The Rolling Stones performed a free concert in Hyde Park 2 days after his death, dedicating it to Brian's memory. Mick Jagger read from Shelley's Adonais as thousands of white butterflies were released into the crowd. Brian Jones was buried in his hometown of Cheltenham. His grave became a pilgrimage site for fans who remembered him as the band's original architect. Number 3. Jimi Hendrix. Just over a year later, Another musician who had redefined what a guitar could do would join him. James Marshall Hendricks arrived in London in September 1966 with little more than his instrument and extraordinary talent. Within months, he had become the most talked-about guitarist in the world. Born Johnny Allen Hendricks on November 27, 1942, in Seattle, Washington, he endured a childhood marked by poverty and instability. His parents, Al and Lucille, had a turbulent marriage filled with separations and reconciliations. Lucille struggled with alcoholism and eventually lost custody of her children. She died when Jimmy was 15. He rarely spoke publicly about her, but friends said the loss haunted him throughout his life. Jimmy taught himself guitar as a teenager, practicing obsessively on a cheap acoustic his father purchased for him. He was left-handed but often played right-handed instruments flipped upside down, developing an unorthodox technique that became part of his signature sound. After a brief stint in the Army, cut short by an injury, he began working as a sideman for rhythm and blues acts, including Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, and King Curtis. In 1966, Chas Chandler of the Animals discovered Jimmy playing in a New York club and convinced him to relocate to England. There, Chandler assembled the Jimi Hendrix Experience with bassist Noel Redding and drummer Mitch Mitchell. The trio released their debut single, Hey Joe, in December 1966. It reached number 6 on the UK charts. The following year brought Purple Haze, The Wind Cries Mary, and the album Are You Experienced? Jimmy's performances combined technical virtuosity with theatrical showmanship. He played guitar with his teeth, behind his back, and famously set his instrument on fire at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967. His reputation grew rapidly. He headlined major festivals and sold out arena tours across Europe and America. At Woodstock in August 1969, his distorted rendition of The Star-Spangled Banner became one of the defining moments of the counterculture era. Critics praised his innovation, while some traditionalists dismissed his theatrics as gimmickry. Jimmy himself expressed frustration with audience expectations, telling interviewers he wanted to move beyond the wild man image and explore new musical directions. Behind the stage persona, Jimmy battled exhaustion, management disputes, and substance abuse. He consumed alcohol, cannabis, LSD, and barbiturates with increasing frequency. His schedule was relentless. Former associates described a man who was generous, soft-spoken, and deeply private, but also prone to mood swings and bouts of insecurity. He often slept poorly and relied on pills to manage his energy levels. In September 1970, Jimmy traveled to London for a series of performances and recording sessions. On the night of September 17th, he attended a party and later went to the Samarkand Hotel with girlfriend Monica Dannemann. According to her account, they talked until the early morning hours. She gave him sleeping tablets to help him rest. When she awoke around mid-morning on September 18th, she found him unresponsive. Vomit stained the bed and his airways. Emergency services were called, but efforts to revive him failed. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to aspiration of vomit while intoxicated with barbiturates. He was 27 years old. Questions about his final hours persisted for decades. Dannemann's account changed over multiple tellings, raising suspicions among investigators and biographers. Some suggested he had taken far more pills than prescribed, possibly intentionally. Others pointed to the chaotic circumstances of his management and personal life as contributing factors. No definitive explanation ever emerged. Jimi Hendrix was buried in Seattle on October 1st, 1970. Mourners included musicians who had idolized him and family members who had barely known him during his years of fame. His father, Al, later established a memorial and garden at the gravesite. The recordings Jimmy left behind continued to influence generations of guitarists. His techniques, including controlled feedback, wah-wah effects, and innovative use of amplification, became foundational elements of rock music. In death, both Brian Jones and Jimi Hendrix became symbols of the era's excesses and its toll on young artists. They had reached heights of fame that few musicians ever experience, only to be consumed by the very forces that propelled them there. Their names joined Robert Johnson's on a list that was beginning to take ominous shape. The age of 27 had claimed 3 of music's most influential figures in just over a year. And the pattern was not finished. Number 4, Janis Joplin. She sang like she was tearing something out of herself, raw and desperate and utterly without pretense. Janis Joplin became the voice of a generation that demanded authenticity above all else. But the intensity that made her performances unforgettable also consumed her from within. Born on January 19, 1943, in Port Arthur, Texas, Janis Lyn Joplin entered a world that would never quite accept her. Port Arthur was a conservative oil refinery town on the Gulf Coast, a place where conformity was expected and difference was punished. Janis was different from the start. She was intelligent and artistic, interested in painting and reading poetry, while her classmates focused on football games and social hierarchies. She struggled with her weight and her skin, enduring severe acne that left her feeling isolated and unattractive. In high school, Janis found herself targeted by bullies who mocked her appearance and unconventional interests. She sought refuge in music, discovering the blues recordings of Bessie Smith, Lead Belly, and Odetta. Their raw emotional power spoke to something deep inside her. She began singing at local coffee houses and folk clubs, developing a style that drew from African American blues traditions, rarely embraced by white performers of her era. Her voice was unlike anything Port Arthur had produced. It was huge and ragged, capable of shifting from a whisper to a scream within a single phrase. After graduating high school in 1960, Janis drifted between Texas, California, and other destinations, searching for a community that would accept her. She enrolled briefly at the University of Texas at Austin, but dropped out. She experimented with drugs and alcohol during these years, developing habits that would shadow her for the rest of her life. In 1963, she hitchhiked to San Francisco, where the beatnik scene was giving way to something new. She performed in coffee shops and bars, building a small following among those who recognized her extraordinary talent. By 1965, Janis had returned to Texas in an attempt to clean up her life. She enrolled at Lamar University and tried to conform to expectations. She even became engaged to a man her family approved of. But the pull of music proved too strong. In 1966, she received a call inviting her to audition for a San Francisco band called Big Brother and the Holding Company. She left Texas and never looked back. Big Brother was a psychedelic rock band with loose, improvisational arrangements. Janis's voice provided the focus they had been lacking. Her performances with the group became legendary in the Bay Area. When they appeared at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, Janis delivered a rendition of Big Mama Thornton's Ball and Chain that left the audience stunned. Cameras captured the reaction of Mama Cass Elliot in the crowd, her mouth open in disbelief. The performance announced Janis Joplin as a major new voice in American music. Columbia Records signed Big Brother shortly after Monterey. Their 1968 album, Cheap Thrills, reached #1 on the charts and sold over 1 million copies. Janis's face appeared on the cover, illustrated by underground artist Robert Crumb. She became one of the most recognizable figures of the counterculture, known for her feather bows, round glasses, and Southern Comfort bottle that accompanied her everywhere. Critics compared her to the great blues singers she idolized. Fans adored her apparent authenticity, her refusal to present a polished image. But success brought pressures that amplified her insecurities. She left Big Brother in late 1968, amid tensions over her growing fame and the band's limited musicianship. She formed a new backing group, the Cosmic Blues Band, and pursued a more soulful direction. Critics were less enthusiastic about the results. Her 1969 album, I Got Dem Ol' Cosmic Blues Again, Mama, received mixed reviews. Some felt she was straying from what made her special. Others noted that her voice showed signs of strain from relentless touring and substance abuse. Throughout this period, Janis battled loneliness that fame could not cure. She spoke openly in interviews about her need for love and her difficulty finding lasting relationships. She dated men and women, but rarely found the stability she craved. Her drinking escalated, and she used heroin intermittently despite attempts to quit. Friends worried about her health. They saw a woman who gave everything on stage but returned to empty hotel rooms and continued substance use. In 1970, Janis formed a new band called Full Tilt Boogie and began recording what would become her final album. The sessions took place at Sunset Sound Studios in Los Angeles throughout the summer and fall. Janis was reportedly in good spirits, excited about the material and optimistic about her future. She had recently become engaged to Seth Morgan, a Berkeley student she had been dating. Colleagues noted that she seemed happier than she had in years. On the night of October 3, 1970, Janis left the recording studio and returned to the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood, where she was staying during the sessions. According to later accounts, she purchased heroin from her regular dealer. The batch was unusually pure, a fact that had already caused several overdoses among other users that week. Janis injected the drug and went to the hotel lobby to buy cigarettes. She returned to her room sometime around 1 a.m. When Janis failed to appear at the studio the following day, road manager John Cook went to check on her. He found her body wedged between the bed and a nightstand. She was clutching money in her hand, change from the cigarette purchase. The coroner determined she had died from an accidental heroin overdose, compounded by the alcohol in her system. She was 27 years old. News of her death devastated the music community. She was the second major rock star to die at 27 in less than 3 weeks, following Jimi Hendrix on September 18th. The coincidence struck many observers as eerie. Janis had reportedly been shaken by Jimmy's death and commented to friends about the tragedy of dying so young. Now she had joined him. Her funeral was held on October 7, 1970, at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Per her wishes, her ashes were scattered along the coast of Marin County, north of San Francisco. She left behind instructions for a party to be held in her honor, funded by $2,500 from her estate. The gathering took place at a Marin County bar, where friends and fellow musicians celebrated her life. The album she had been recording was completed posthumously and released in January 1971 as Pearl, a nickname her friends had given her. It became the biggest commercial success of her career, reaching #1 and eventually selling over 4 million copies. The single, Me and Bobby McGee, written by Chris Christopherson, became her only #1 hit, released months after her death. Other tracks like Mercedes-Benz and Get It While You Can showcased the voice that had made her famous. Janis Joplin's legacy extends beyond her recordings. She shattered expectations for female rock performers, proving that women could command stages with the same raw power as their male counterparts. She paved the way for artists who followed, from Stevie Nicks to Florence Welch. Her struggles with addiction and self-image also became part of her story, a cautionary tale about the costs of fame and the industry's failure to protect vulnerable artists. In 1995, she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In 2005, she received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Biographies, documentaries, and a Broadway musical have explored her life. Port Arthur, the town that once rejected her, now hosts a museum in her honor. The girl who never fit in became one of the most celebrated voices in American music history. Her death at 27 added another name to a growing list. 4 major musicians had now died at that age within a span of just over 2 years. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Number 5. Jim Morrison. He called himself the Lizard King and cultivated an image of shamanic excess that thrilled audiences and alarmed authorities. Jim Morrison was the frontman of The Doors, a band that merged rock, blues, and poetry into something entirely new. But behind the leather pants and provocative stage antics was a man struggling with demons he could not name. Born James Douglas Morrison on December 8, 1943, in Melbourne, Florida, he was the son of a career naval officer. His father, George Stephen Morrison, would eventually become an admiral, commanding the fleet during a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War. The family moved constantly throughout Jim's childhood, following military assignments across the country. He later claimed to have witnessed a fatal car accident involving Native Americans on a New Mexico highway as a young child, an event he said profoundly shaped his worldview. Biographers have questioned whether the incident occurred as he described it. Jim was intellectually precocious, devouring books on philosophy, poetry, and psychology. He enrolled at UCLA's film school in the early 1960s, where he met keyboardist Ray Manzarek. The two began collaborating on songs, with Jim providing lyrics drawn from notebooks he had filled with poetry. They recruited guitarist Robbie Krieger and drummer John Densmore, forming The Doors in 1965. The band's name came from Aldous Huxley's book The Doors of Perception, which itself referenced a William Blake poem about cleansing perception to see infinity. Their self-titled debut album, released in 1967, produced the #1 single that introduced Jim Morrison to America. The extended version featured an improvised section that was controversial for its time. The Doors became one of the biggest acts in rock music, blending Morrison's baritone vocals and poetic lyrics with Manzarek's distinctive organ sound. Jim cultivated a mystique that combined intellectual pretension with raw sexuality. He spoke in interviews about expanding consciousness and transcending ordinary experience. But his behavior grew increasingly erratic as fame intensified. He drank heavily, often arriving at performances intoxicated beyond the point of coherence. He provoked audiences and authorities, inviting chaos wherever he appeared. A 1967 incident in New Haven resulted in his arrest on stage. A 1969 concert in Miami led to charges of indecent exposure and public intoxication after he allegedly exposed himself to the crowd. He denied the accusations, but the legal battle consumed the final years of his life. By 1970, Jim had grown weary of performing. He wanted to focus on poetry and film, the art forms he considered more serious than rock music. The Doors continued recording, but tensions within the band reflected Jim's declining reliability. His weight fluctuated dramatically, and his drinking showed no signs of abating. Friends described a man who seemed to be deliberately destroying himself while searching for something he could not articulate. In March 1971, Jim moved to Paris with his girlfriend, Pamela Courson. He told associates he was taking a break from the music industry to write. The couple settled into an apartment in the Marais district. Jim grew a beard, lost some weight, and seemed to find temporary peace. He spent his days visiting bookshops, cafes, and historic sites. He continued working on poetry and explored the possibility of making films. On the night of July 2nd, 1971, Jim and Pamela went to a movie and returned home late. According to Pamela's account, Jim felt unwell during the night and took a bath to ease his discomfort. When she checked on him in the early morning hours of July 3rd, she found him dead in the bathtub. She called for help, but nothing could be done. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. No autopsy was performed, as French law did not require one when no foul play was suspected. The circumstances immediately sparked speculation. Jim had a history of respiratory problems and possible undiagnosed heart issues. Some believed he had overdosed on heroin, either intentionally or accidentally. Others suggested he had died elsewhere and been placed in the bathtub to conceal the true circumstances. Pamela's own heroin addiction added complexity to her testimony. She died 3 years later, also at the age of 27, taking whatever she knew with her. Jim Morrison was buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, joining other legendary figures including Oscar Wilde and Edith Piaf. His grave became a pilgrimage site, often vandalized and covered with graffiti. The remaining members of the Doors continued recording briefly before disbanding. Jim's poetry collections were published posthumously, receiving mixed critical reception. His image endured as a symbol of artistic rebellion and youthful self-destruction. He was 27 years old when he died. Number 6. Jean-Michel Basquiat. Nearly 2 decades would pass before another artist joined the informal roster at that same age. This time from an entirely different creative world. Jean-Michel Basquiat never set out to become a painter. He started as a graffiti artist, tagging subway cars and building walls in Lower Manhattan with cryptic messages under the name Samo. Born on December 22, 1960, in Brooklyn, New York, to a Haitian father and Puerto Rican mother, Jean-Michel showed artistic talent early. His mother took him to museums and encouraged his creative instincts. But his childhood was turbulent. His parents separated when he was young, and his mother was eventually institutionalized for mental illness. Jean-Michel lived with his father, who was often strict and sometimes abusive. By his late teens, Jean-Michel had dropped out of high school and left home. He survived by selling hand-painted postcards and T-shirts on the streets of Manhattan. His Samo graffiti, featuring phrases like "Samo as an end to mind-wash religion" and "Samo saves idiots," attracted attention in the downtown art scene. He moved through nightclubs and galleries, befriending musicians, filmmakers, and fellow artists. His charisma opened doors that his unconventional background might otherwise have kept closed. In 1980, Jean-Michel participated in a group exhibition called the Times Square Show, which brought attention to the emerging downtown art movement. Critics began noticing his paintings, which combined graffiti elements with anatomical drawings, historical references, and scrawled text. His work addressed race, colonialism, and the commodification of black bodies with an intensity that unsettled some viewers and captivated others. By 1982, he had become one of the youngest artists ever exhibited at the prestigious Documenta show in Germany. He was only 21 years old. Fame and fortune arrived rapidly. Galleries clamored for his work. Collectors paid tens of thousands of dollars for paintings he produced in marathon sessions fueled by drugs and sleeplessness. He collaborated with Andy Warhol, producing joint canvases that merged their distinct styles. The art world embraced him as a prodigy while simultaneously exoticizing his background and blackness. Jean-Michel was acutely aware of these dynamics and often expressed frustration with how he was perceived and marketed. His heroin use intensified throughout the mid-1980s. Friends watched him deteriorate, losing weight and becoming increasingly paranoid. He entered and exited rehabilitation programs without lasting success. When Andy Warhol died in February 1987, Jean-Michel was devastated. He lost one of his closest friends and most important creative partners. His drug consumption escalated further in the months that followed. On August 12, 1988, Jean-Michel Basquiat was found dead in his Great Jones Street studio in Manhattan. The cause was acute mixed drug intoxication, primarily heroin. He was 27 years old. The art world mourned a talent extinguished far too soon. Critics and collectors debated his legacy while prices for his work continued to climb. Today, his paintings sell for over $100 million at auction. His story illustrated how the pressures of sudden fame could destroy even the most original talents. Like the musicians who preceded him on the list, Jean-Michel had risen quickly, burned brightly, and fallen before reaching 30. The age of 27 had now claimed artists across genres and decades, suggesting patterns that defied easy explanation. Number 7. Kurt Cobain. He spoke for a generation that felt alienated from the polished excess of mainstream rock. Kurt Cobain became the reluctant voice of disaffected youth, channeling anger and vulnerability into music that redefined what popular songs could express. But the fame he achieved suffocated him, and the depression he battled since childhood eventually proved insurmountable. Born on February 20th, 1967, in Aberdeen, Washington, Kurt Donald Cobain entered a working-class family that would fracture before he reached adolescence. His father, Donald, was an auto mechanic. His mother, Wendy, worked as a waitress. For his first 8 years, Kurt was described as a happy and energetic child who loved drawing and music. He showed early artistic ability, covering notebook pages with cartoon characters and imaginary creatures. Everything changed when his parents divorced in 1975. Kurt was devastated by the separation. He later said that the divorce destroyed his faith in love and security. He bounced between relatives, sometimes staying with his father, sometimes with his mother, sometimes with aunts and uncles who struggled to manage his increasingly difficult behavior. He became withdrawn and angry. He was prescribed Ritalin for hyperactivity, and his mood swings intensified. By his teenage years, he had been diagnosed with depression and bronchitis that may have masked early signs of the chronic stomach pain that would plague him throughout his life. Music became his refuge. He received his first guitar at age 14 and taught himself to play by listening to records. He absorbed punk rock, discovering bands like the Sex Pistols, Black Flag, and the Pixies. He also loved classic rock and pop, from the Beatles to Cheap Trick. His tastes were eclectic, but his sensibility was rooted in the raw, unpolished aesthetic of underground music. He formed his first bands in high school, playing at parties in small venues around Aberdeen. The town offered little opportunity, and Kurt dreamed of escaping. After dropping out of high school, he drifted through menial jobs and periods of homelessness. He slept under bridges and in friends' apartments, scraping together enough to buy guitar strings and drugs. He experimented with marijuana, LSD, and eventually heroin, which he later claimed helped ease his stomach problems when nothing else worked. In 1987, he formed Nirvana with bassist Krist Novoselic. The two had bonded over their shared love of punk and their outsider status in conservative Aberdeen. Nirvana released their debut album, Bleach, in 1989 on the independent label Sub Pop. The record sold modestly but attracted critical attention for its blend of heavy guitar riffs and melodic sensibility. They toured relentlessly, building a following in underground rock circles. In 1990, drummer Dave Grohl joined the band, solidifying the lineup that would change music history. They signed with major label DGC Records and began recording their second album. Nevermind was released on September 24, 1991. No one anticipated what followed. The album's first single featured a quiet verse structure that exploded into a distorted chorus, a dynamic that would define the grunge sound. Radio stations added it to rotation. MTV played the video constantly. By January 1992, Nevermind had displaced Michael Jackson at the top of the Billboard charts. Kurt Cobain, the kid from Aberdeen who had slept under bridges, was suddenly the biggest rock star in America. He hated almost everything about it. In interviews, he expressed discomfort with the audiences Nirvana attracted, fearing that the jocks and conformists he despised in high school were now buying his records. He resented the media intrusion into his private life. He struggled with the contradiction of becoming a commercial phenomenon while holding anti-commercial values. His stomach problems worsened under the stress of touring, and his heroin use escalated. In February 1992, Kurt married Courtney Love, the frontwoman of the band Hole. Their relationship was intense, volatile, and heavily scrutinized. When Courtney became pregnant, tabloids speculated about drug use during the pregnancy. A September 1992 Vanity Fair article portrayed them as irresponsible addicts, leading to a child welfare investigation after their daughter Frances Bean was born. Kurt was furious at what he perceived as media persecution. The episode deepened his distrust of journalists and public life. Nirvana released their third album, In Utero, in September 1993. The record was deliberately abrasive, an apparent attempt to shed some of the mainstream audience. It still debuted at number 1. They continued touring through the fall and into 1994. But Kurt's health deteriorated visibly. He was thin, often sick, and increasingly dependent on heroin. In March 1994, while on tour in Rome, he overdosed on a combination of champagne and Rohypnol. He fell into a coma and was hospitalized. The incident was described publicly as an accident, but some close to him suspected it was a suicide attempt. After returning to Seattle, Kurt agreed to enter a rehabilitation facility in Los Angeles. He stayed for less than 2 days before climbing over a wall and flying back to Washington. His family and management were frantic. They hired private investigators to find him. Courtney filed a missing persons report. For several days, no one knew where he was. On April 8, 1994, an electrician arrived at Kurt's Seattle home to install a security system. He noticed a body through the window of a room above the garage. Police found Kurt Cobain dead from a self-inflicted shotgun wound. A suicide note was discovered nearby, addressed to his childhood imaginary friend Boda. The note expressed exhaustion with fame, frustration with his own lack of passion for music, and love for his wife and daughter. The coroner estimated he had died on April 5th. He was 27 years old. The news devastated fans worldwide. MTV broadcast continuous coverage. Radio stations played Nirvana songs in tribute. In Seattle, thousands gathered for a public vigil at a park near the Space Needle. Courtney Love read portions of the suicide note aloud. Several fans took their own lives in the days that followed, prompting mental health organizations to issue warnings about suicide contagion. Kurt Cobain's mother gave a quote to the Aberdeen newspaper that would define the phenomenon for decades to come. Referencing the musicians who had died at the same age, she said he had joined that stupid club. The comment crystallized public awareness of the pattern. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and now Kurt Cobain, all dead at 27, all consumed by the pressures of fame and the substances they used to cope. The notion of a cursed age took hold in popular imagination. In death, Kurt became an icon in ways he would have found deeply uncomfortable. His face appeared on T-shirts worn by the same mainstream consumers he had criticized. His lyrics were analyzed for hidden meanings. Biographies, documentaries, and conspiracy theories proliferated. Some refused to accept that he had taken his own life, pointing to inconsistencies in the evidence and suggesting foul play. No credible investigation has supported these claims. Nirvana's music continued to resonate with new generations. Nevermind has sold over 30 million copies worldwide. Kurt was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014. His daughter Frances Bean has spoken publicly about growing up without her father, expressing both grief and frustration with those who romanticize his death. His legacy is complicated. He gave voice to alienation and pain in ways that connected with millions of listeners. He also demonstrated the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and addiction. The music industry he criticized has not fundamentally changed its treatment of artists in crisis. The fame machine continues to consume young talents who lack the support systems to survive it. Kurt Cobain wanted to make music that mattered. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. He also became a cautionary tale about the costs of that success. The boy from Aberdeen who felt like he never belonged anywhere found himself belonging to everyone, and the weight of that belonging destroyed him. His name joined the roster of 27-year-old artists whose brilliance was matched only by their fragility. And within weeks of his death, another member of the Seattle music scene would follow him. Number 8. Kristen Pfaff. She was preparing to leave Seattle when death found her. Kristen Pfaff had packed her belongings, rented a moving truck, and made plans to return to Minneapolis, where she hoped to rebuild her life away from the chaos that had consumed her. But she never made it out of the city. Born Kristen Marie Parco on May 26, 1967, in Buffalo, New York, she grew up in a family with deep musical roots. Her birth father came from a lineage of accomplished musicians. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother later remarried Norman Pfaff, who adopted Kristen. She studied classical piano from age 5 through her teenage years, developing technical skills that would later inform her approach to other instruments. Kristen attended Boston College before transferring to the University of Minnesota, where she discovered the underground rock scene that would shape her career. She picked up the bass guitar and began playing in local bands. Her talent was immediately apparent. She possessed both technical proficiency and an instinct for crafting bass lines that elevated the songs around her. In Minneapolis, she joined a noise rock band called Janitor Joe, whose abrasive sound earned them a following in alternative music circles. In 1993, Kristen was spotted by members of Hole while performing with Janitor Joe in California. Courtney Love and guitarist Eric Erlandson were searching for a new bassist following the departure of their previous player. They pursued Kristen aggressively. She initially declined, reluctant to leave Minneapolis and the life she had built there. Her father encouraged her to reconsider, pointing out that Hole was signed to a major label and poised for significant success. Her mother was more hesitant, sensing that Seattle might not be a healthy environment for her daughter. Kristen eventually accepted and moved to Seattle to join Hole. She began a romantic relationship with Eric Erlandson. The band was recording what would become their breakthrough album, and Kristen's contributions proved essential. Producers later praised her performance, noting that every bass track on the record was captured during initial sessions with no need for overdubs. Her playing was tight, intuitive, and powerful. The album was completed in early 1994 and scheduled for release in April. But Seattle's music scene was saturated with heroin, and Kristen was not immune. She developed a habit that worried those close to her. Bandmate Patty Skemmel later recalled that she and Kristen would use together while trying to hide the extent of their consumption from others. The drug offered temporary relief from the pressures of the industry and the intensity of working with Courtney Love, whose personality dominated every room she entered. The album was released on April 12, 1994, just 4 days after Kurt Cobain's body was discovered. The timing cast a shadow over what should have been a triumphant moment. Courtney was consumed by grief and media scrutiny. The band's scheduled tour was postponed. Kristen, already struggling with addiction and creative differences within the group, decided to leave Hole and return to Minneapolis. She entered a rehabilitation program in February 1994 and seemed committed to getting clean. In June, she returned to Seattle briefly to collect her belongings and finalize her departure. Her U-Haul was packed and waiting in the garage. A friend named Paul Erickson planned to accompany her on the drive back to Minnesota. On the night of June 15, 1994, Kristen gathered the last of her things. Erickson slept in her car to guard her possessions. Eric Erlandson stopped by the apartment that evening for a brief visit. When Erickson checked on Kristen later that night, he heard her snoring in the bathroom and thought nothing of it. She was known to fall asleep in the bath. The next morning, Erickson found the bathroom door still locked. When he broke it down, he discovered Kristen unresponsive in shallow water. Drug paraphernalia was found nearby. She was pronounced dead from acute opiate intoxication. She was 27 years old, dead less than 3 months after Kurt Cobain. The Seattle music community reeled from another loss. Hole released a statement expressing anguish over the tragedy. Kristen's mother never fully accepted the official account of her daughter's death, noting that she had been clean and eager to start fresh. Kristen Pfaff's contributions to music were overshadowed by the circumstances of her death and the larger figures who surrounded her. But those who worked with her recognized her exceptional talent. She remains one of the forgotten members of the 27 Club, her story a footnote to the more famous tragedies of that era. Her name deserves to be remembered alongside those whose deaths commanded greater attention. Number 9. Amy Winehouse. Nearly 2 decades later, another woman with an extraordinary voice would join her. Amy Winehouse sang like the jazz and soul legends she idolized, channeling decades of musical tradition through a voice that seemed impossibly mature for her years. Born on September 14, 1983, in London, England, she grew up in a Jewish family with deep roots in music. Her father's side included professional jazz musicians, and Amy absorbed their influence from childhood. She attended performing arts schools where her talent was recognized early. By her mid-teens, she was writing songs and performing in local venues. Her debut album was released in 2003 when she was just 19. Critics praised her sophisticated phrasing and sardonic lyrics. She won an Ivor Novello Award for songwriting and seemed poised for a significant career. But it was her second album, released in 2006, that transformed her into an international phenomenon. The record blended 1960s soul with contemporary production and brutally honest lyrics about addiction, heartbreak, and self-destruction. The lead single became inescapable. Its defiant chorus about refusing treatment resonating with listeners, even as it documented her actual struggles. The album won 5 Grammy Awards, including Record of the Year and Best New Artist. Amy became one of the most celebrated vocalists of her generation. But success accelerated her decline. Her marriage to Blake Fielder Civil was turbulent and reportedly introduced her to harder drugs. Paparazzi documented her every stumble, Tabloids published photographs of her looking increasingly unwell, her beehive hairstyle and winged eyeliner becoming symbols of glamour, undermined by visible deterioration. Her public appearances grew erratic. Concerts were canceled or cut short when she appeared too intoxicated to perform. A 2011 tour was abandoned after the opening show, where she seemed confused and unable to engage with the audience. Friends and family attempted interventions. Her father spoke publicly about his fears for her life. She entered and exited rehabilitation programs without lasting success. On July 23, 2011, Amy Winehouse was found dead in her London apartment. The initial inquest was inconclusive, but a second investigation determined she had died from accidental alcohol poisoning. Her blood alcohol level was more than 5 times the legal driving limit. She had apparently attempted to quit drinking abruptly, a process that can be medically dangerous for severe alcoholics. She was 27 years old. Her death prompted an outpouring of grief and reflection on how the entertainment industry treats artists in crisis. Critics noted that her struggles had been treated as entertainment rather than emergencies. The same media that profited from her downfall now published tributes to her genius. Her family established a foundation in her name to support young people struggling with addiction. A documentary released in 2015 traced her life through archival footage and interviews, depicting a woman whose talent was matched by her vulnerability. Viewers saw the joy she took in music alongside the pain that fame intensified. The film won an Academy Award and introduced her story to audiences who had known her only through tabloid headlines. Amy Winehouse left behind 2 studio albums and a legacy that continues to influence singers worldwide. Her voice, simultaneously fragile and powerful, captured emotions that words alone could not express. Her death at 27 added another name to a list that had grown too long. The pattern that began with Robert Johnson in Mississippi had now claimed a woman in London, separated by decades and oceans, but united by talent, struggle, and the same tragic age. Number 10. Anton Yelchin. He was not a musician, but an actor, one of the most promising talents of his generation. Anton Yelchin died not from addiction or suicide, but from a freak accident that seemed cruelly random. His inclusion in the 27 Club illustrates how the phenomenon has expanded beyond its musical origins, to encompass any young artist whose life ends at that fateful age. Born on March 11, 1989, in Leningrad, Soviet Union, Anton Viktorovich Yelchin entered the world just as the empire of his birth was crumbling. His parents, Irina and Viktor Yelchin, were professional figure skaters who had competed at the highest levels of Soviet athletics. When Anton was 6 months old, they emigrated to the United States, settling in Los Angeles with limited resources and uncertain prospects. The transition was difficult. His parents spoke little English and struggled to find work in their field. They eventually became skating coaches and choreographers, building a modest life in Southern California. Anton grew up bilingual, speaking Russian at home while absorbing American culture through television and movies. He was a sensitive child who showed early interest in performance. His parents enrolled him in acting classes, where his natural ability quickly became apparent. By age 9, Anton had begun landing roles in film and television. He appeared in independent productions and guest spots on network shows. Directors noticed his intensity and emotional range, unusual qualities in child actors. He was not conventionally cute or precocious. Instead, he projected a seriousness that made him suitable for complex roles. In 2001, he delivered a breakthrough performance in a film about a young chess prodigy, earning critical attention that would define his career trajectory. Throughout his teenage years, Anton balanced education with an increasingly demanding acting schedule. He attended classes at a private school in Los Angeles while appearing in studio films and independent productions. He developed a reputation for choosing challenging material over commercial projects. Directors praised his work ethic and his willingness to disappear into characters. Unlike many young actors who cultivated public personas, Anton remained private and focused on craft. In 2009, he was cast in a role that would bring him mainstream recognition. The science fiction franchise offered him the part of a young navigator, a character beloved by fans for decades. Anton brought humor and warmth to the role across 3 films, winning over audiences who might not have known his earlier work. The franchise made him a recognizable face, while his independent films continued to earn festival awards and critical respect. Those who worked with him described a young man of unusual depth. He was an avid photographer who documented his travels and surroundings with artistic sensibility. He collected vintage objects and immersed himself in cinema history, watching classic films and discussing them with the passion of a scholar. He played guitar and expressed interest in music, though acting remained his primary focus. Friends noted his kindness and lack of pretension, qualities that distinguished him in an industry often marked by ego. Anton also lived with a chronic health condition that required ongoing management. He had been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis as a child, a genetic disorder affecting the lungs and digestive system. He rarely discussed his illness publicly, preferring to focus on his work rather than his limitations. Those close to him understood that he approached each project knowing his time might be shorter than others assumed. In June 2016, Anton was preparing for another busy period. He had multiple films in various stages of production and development. On the night of June 18th, he attended a gathering with friends and returned to his home in Studio City. His house sat on a steep driveway, a common feature in the hillside neighborhoods of Los Angeles. Sometime in the early morning hours of June 19th, Anton got out of his vehicle in his driveway. The car, a model later found to have a confusing gear shift mechanism that had caused numerous accidents, rolled backward. Anton was pinned between the vehicle and a brick pillar attached to a security fence. The compression to his chest caused asphyxiation. He was discovered by friends who arrived later that morning to pick him up for a rehearsal. He was 27 years old. The news shocked the entertainment industry. Tributes poured in from directors, actors, and fans who had admired his work. The science fiction franchise released a statement mourning the loss of a beloved cast member. Independent filmmakers spoke of projects that would never be completed. His parents, who had sacrificed everything to give their son opportunities in America, were left to grieve a child whose potential remained largely unfulfilled. Investigations into the accident revealed that the vehicle manufacturer had received numerous complaints about the gear shift design. The mechanism made it difficult for drivers to confirm the car was in park. Hundreds of rollaway incidents had been reported before Anton's death. His family filed a lawsuit against the manufacturer, eventually reaching a settlement. The case prompted renewed attention to automotive safety standards and corporate accountability. Anton Yelchin left behind a filmography that demonstrated remarkable range for someone so young. His final performances were released posthumously, allowing audiences to witness the talent that death had interrupted. Critics reflected on what he might have accomplished given more time. His name joined a list that had begun with blues musicians in the Mississippi Delta and now included actors in Hollywood. The 27 Club remains a subject of fascination and debate. Skeptics point out that the pattern is largely a matter of selective attention. Many artists die at other ages without generating the same cultural significance. Statistical analyses have found no actual spike in musician deaths at 27 compared to surrounding ages. The phenomenon persists because human beings seek patterns, especially in tragedy. We want death to mean something, even when it is random. Yet the names on the list share more than an age. Robert Johnson, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Kurt Cobain, Kristen Pfaff, Amy Winehouse, Anton Yelchin. Each possessed extraordinary talent recognized early. Each achieved fame that brought pressures most people never experience. Many struggled with substances that offered temporary relief from pain they could not otherwise manage. Some battled mental illness in eras when treatment was inadequate or stigmatized. All died before reaching the stability that often comes with age. Their stories raise uncomfortable questions about how society treats its artists. The entertainment industry profits from talent while often failing to protect those who generate that profit. Record labels, studios, and management companies extract value from young performers without providing adequate support for their well-being. The media sensationalizes struggles that might otherwise remain private, turning personal crises into public entertainment. Fans consume art without considering the human cost of its creation. The 27 Club also reflects broader patterns of mortality among young people. Addiction, mental illness, and accidents claim lives across all demographics, not just among the famous. What distinguishes celebrity deaths is the attention they receive and the meaning we assign to them. When Amy Winehouse died, millions mourned. When anonymous young people die from the same causes, their names appear only in local obituaries. Perhaps the most honest response to the 27 Club is simply grief. These were human beings with families, friends, and futures that were stolen. They created works that continue to move and inspire long after their deaths. They also suffered in ways that fame could not prevent and may have intensified. Their ages at death may be coincidence, but their losses are real. The list remains open. New names may yet be added by tragedy not yet occurred. Each edition will prompt the same questions about fate, fame, and fragility. The pattern will continue to fascinate those who study it and haunt those who fear it. And the music, art, and performances left behind will endure as monuments to lives that burned too brightly and ended too soon. 10 names, 10 stories, one impossible age. The 27 Club asks no one to join, but accepts all who arrive at its door. Those who pass through leave behind legacies that outlast their brief years. They remind us that genius offers no protection from mortality, and that the brightest flames often extinguish first. Their work survives. Their absence remains.